Somebody got your lost purchasing power. Who? Let's track it. Those people who got the lost purchasing power were the ones who were right at the point where the new money was injected into the pot. Because they got their hands on it first, and at that point it had full value. But by the time they spent it and gave it to the next person, and then they spent it and it started moving out toward the edge of the pot where most of us are, then it lost its value. But the ones up at the nozzle were the ones that had gained on our lost purchasing power. Who are they? Well, it's clear that the government is number one, isn't it? Because that first check, that billion-dollar check that we tracked, went to the government, number one. They got it first. What about the money created on the banking side of the partnership? Who got that first? Well, the borrowers, didn't they? The ones that lined up at that window. That was the nozzle. Now, this is something that we all recognize. In times of inflation, everybody says it's wise to borrow. Why? Because you borrow dollars, but you pay back in dimes. Inflation erodes that thing. You have contracts, and you pay back with money that has less and less value. So the poor guy that gets your payment at the end of the line has lost his purchasing power, but you gained it because you were smart enough to borrow in times of inflation. That's the way it works. That's one of the reasons they entice people into debt, because it's the smart thing to do. What they don't tell you, however, is that what you are gaining from this process, you are turning around and having to pay to the bank in the form of interest payments on that loan. Interest on nothing. The bank is actually capturing your gain through interest payments. Now, sometimes you have paper profits. Oh, look at the value of this real estate. Look at the value of this stock. People are paying more and more for it. But don't forget, ladies and gentlemen, that economic conditions can change, and these paper assets can contract as well as expand. And when the economy does contract, as usually it does, always does, then people are wiped out. They don't realize that the boom-bust cycles that we have had since the creation of this Federal Reserve mechanism is like a sawtooth. The economy expands slowly for long periods of time, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, and people think this is going to go on forever. And then, boom, it comes down, usually very quickly. A lot of people lose their assets. And then it starts again for another 20 or 30 or 40 years. Oh, it's a wonderful ride, and then, boom, it comes down. And every time it comes down, people lose their investments. Notice, however, when you go to the bank and they give you something which costs them nothing to create, what do they want from you in return? Signature on the dotted line for your car, your house, all your assets, right? So if you can't make your payments of this nothing money, they get your marbles. They always win. In times of whether it's expansion or contraction, it doesn't make any difference. It was planned that way, carefully worked out. These people are scientists, ladies and gentlemen. This is the bottom line, that those who gain your lost purchasing power are the two groups that comprise the partnership in the Federal Reserve System, the government and the banking cartel. Now, this process is a tax. I don't care what you call it, inflation, or what name you want to give to it, it is a tax. If there's anything you remember about this presentation this evening, I hope it is this, that inflation is a tax. This is why these two groups are in the partnership. On the government side, they are able to tax their citizens in any amount, unlimited amounts of money, without the people even knowing that they are in fact paying a tax. And on the banking side, they are able to collect perpetual interest on nothing. Well, let's go back to Jekyll Island. We have a lot to learn on that island back in those days, because all of what's happening today was germinated right there around that table for 9 days. They had a particular problem, which was what to call this creature You see, this partnership between government and banks was not new with the Federal Reserve System. It actually was conceived in Europe in the 16th century. And it was experimented and then finally perfected with the formation of the Bank of England in 1694. From that date forward, all of the governments of Europe had used this kind of a mechanism. Of course, they didn't call it the Mandrake mechanism like I do. They have another name for it, and that is a central bank. So, when it came time to bring the central bank mechanism to America, these fellows on Jekyll Island knew that's what they were doing, but they couldn't call it a central bank because Congress was already on record as saying they didn't want that, because they thought that what we needed in this country was something that was unique for the American economy. And these men debated what to call it, and this was their strategy. They said, first, let's call it federal, to make it sound like it's a government operation. Next, let's add the word reserve, to make it seem like there are reserves somewhere. Next, let's add the word system. This was far more important than it seems today, because remember, the primary concern was this concentration of power in New York. So they had to convince the American people that they were creating a system of banks spread over the geography of the whole country. First they were going to have 10, then they said, no, that's not enough. We need 12 regional banks to diffuse this power, or the appearance of diffusing it. Well, we realize today that what we got was not federal at all. There are no reserves anywhere. There's not a system in the sense of diffusion of power, and the Federal Reserve banks aren't even banks. So in all four words, we have appearances of the fourth kind. It was brilliant deception, and now the next step was to sell it to the public. The first draft of the Federal Reserve Act was called the Aldrich Bill because it was sponsored by Senator Aldrich, and Paul Warburg warned him against that. He said, Nelson, if you put your name on this bill, it's going to be voted down in Congress because you're so clearly identified with big business interests. And Warburg was right. Congress put thumbs down on it. The bill of the big bankers. Well, it was a minor setback. They took their bill, they scrambled the paragraphs around a little bit, took Aldrich's name off of it, and found a couple of Democrats to sponsor the bill. Now this was different, because everybody knew that the Republicans represented big business. But they also knew that the Democrats, on the other hand, represented the common man. You know, the working man, the fellow on the assembly line, like Ted Kennedy. So they found a couple of millionaire Democrats to sponsor the bill. Carter Glass in the House and Senator Robert Owen, who was himself a very successful banker, sponsored the bill, and now it was the Glass-Owen bill. Next, Aldrich and Vanderlip began to give speeches and interviews to newspaper reporters condemning the bill that they had written. They said, this bill will ruin the banks. It'll be terrible for the nation. And of course, by the time that got into the newspapers and the average person read that, they were saying, golly, the big bankers don't like this bill very much. It must be pretty good. You know, you have to give these fellows credit. They weren't stupid. They didn't get to be where they were by being country bumpkins. They understood mass psychology, they understood politics, and they played their cards exceedingly well. Meanwhile, these same individuals were, out of their own pockets, financing so-called grassroots study clubs that were springing up all over the country, holding public meetings, printing and distributing pamphlets extolling the virtues of the Federal Reserve Act. They gave huge amounts of money to some of our better-known universities in America. established